The Equivocal Decline of U.S.-Russian Relations by James O. Kai Griley, Patrick Sodl, and Braeden Riley.
From 1991 to the 2000s, the U.S.-Russian relations became more passive and cooperative as both nations agreed on military and economic compromises and agreements, aiding each other when in need. However, with the annexation of Crimea and the rise of Putin's nationalistic ideals, their political relationship began to dissolve, placing society into a position in which fears of economic and military consequences of crumbling U.S.-Russian relations once again materialized.
With the end of the Second World War, the U.S. and Russia emerged as global leaders as both nations expanded their economy and global influence from exporting arms and other goods. However, although the U.S. and Russia were allies during the World War, they quickly became enemies as they had differing political ideologies, the U.S. championing democracy and the Soviet Union adhering to communism/nationalism. The U.S. attempted to stop the corrupting influence of communism by setting up democratic governments throughout Europe through the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. After the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs, the USSR competed with the U.S. to reveal the national superiority, officially starting the Cold War. From the space race to the arms race and the continuing problems of containment and expansion of communism in third world countries, both nations seem to have contradictory ideologies and political natures that any form of compromise seemed unattainable. However, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved with free elections, the Berlin Wall came crashing down, and the Iron Curtain, a symbol of the separation between the United States and Russia, disintegrated.
The 1990s to 2000s was a time of peace regarding economic relations and nuclear treaties between the United States and Russia, who were the world superpowers during this time. The United States and Russia cooperated with one another to create nuclear compromises which would limit terrorism. On November 29, 1990, the United States and the Soviet Union voted together in favor of a UN resolution authorizing the use of military force against Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Hussein created the issue of terrorism in the Middle East as he invaded Kuwait to gain control over the massive oil supply in that area, oppressing civilians. The US and Russia surprisingly voted together in favor of a UN resolution to use military force against Hussein after he denied to remove his troops. The military cooperation between the US and Russia sparked a new age in which the United States and Russia entered a stage of cooperation that brought superficial political and social hope. Moreover, in 1991, at the Moscow summit, President Bush and President Gorbachev, the president of Russia, signed the START agreement, which was an agreement aimed at decreasing the number of nuclear heads and establishing other legislations that decreased the usage and reliability of nuclear warheads. The START agreement was ultimately successful, removing about 80% of the world's nuclear storage by 2001, and thus upholding the notion of bettering the relationship between the two dominant nations.
Moving on to the economic relationship during the 1990s and 2000s, there was a strong development of US and USSR economies as there were several amendments lifted off of Russia, allowing Russia to integrate itself into global issues. For example, President Bush's wave of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was a major step. Amid the Cold War, Congress passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which prohibited the Soviet Union and other communist blocs to receive the status of most favored nation, a status that provides equal trade opportunities with other nations that have the title. Thus, Russia being freed from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment gained access to economic opportunities with other countries to expand their nation and become more integrated into the global economy and society. Moreover, the Business Dialogue Report simplified the Russian currency, allowing for smoother transactions and exchanges of currency, benefiting both the US and Russia, and acknowledged Russia as a market economy, which revealed that the US did not believe Russia to be an authoritative government, allowing the people to control the market.
However, this amicable relationship came to a halt with the rise of Vladimir Putin. While U.S.-Russian relations remained solid during his first stint as president of the Russian Federation from 1999 to 2008, his second occupation of the Kremlin marked a turning point in the U.S.'s political dealings with the ex-communist country. Putin, who was once an intelligence officer for the KGB, decided to sever ties with the USSR 2 days in the 1992 coup d'etat, which ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As a politician, Vladimir Putin has led an almost imperialist reign, with a track record of the annexation of nearby nations and being accused by many political experts to be head of a declining democracy, and perhaps moving towards a less than democratic dictatorship.
The relationship between the United States and Russia revealed a superficial waning of tension, especially in military aspects, until Vladimir Putin became the Russian president, who was a strong nationalist. This is best shown by the Russian annexation of Crimea, in which in 2014 Russia stormed the Crimean borders and declared control over the nation. President Barack Obama considered this invasion unethical and undemocratic and signed an executive order in which the United States would place sanctions on individuals or nations that were involved in the annexation of Crimea. Russia was the main perpetrator, and sanctions were imposed on Russia, such as travel bans and restrictions on trade. The main purpose of the signing of the executive order was to persuade Russia and its allies to halt the annexation of Crimea and reestablish a sense of cooperation and order between the two nations. However, the signing failed as Russia continued its effort to annex Crimea and ultimately succeeded. This conflict marked the decline of U.S.-Russian relations and furthered political and military conflicts that persist today as Russia became increasingly connected with and portrayed as a terrorist group.
As U.S.-Russian political ties weakened, each nation's respective sanctions on the other only increased. This is most clearly shown by the consequences of Russia's breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention. In response to this breach, the U.S. closed all shared lines of credit and greatly decreased the available imports and exports between the two nations. As a nation that is still struggling to find its economic foothold as a democracy, this is a fiscally irresponsible action of Putin and the Kremlin. Nevertheless, these sanctions and restrictions remain in place as the Putin administration continues to breach the Chemical Weapons Convention within their own borders.
And overall, the United States and Russia, following the Cold War, were becoming less competitive and more compatible. This all changed when Vladimir Putin and his nationalistic beliefs became president. Starting with the annexation of Crimea, Putin exerted his nationalistic ideology, creating a downward spiral in the relationship between Russia and the United States. The United States has countered Russian efforts through sanctions and other orders, such as the present sanctions created by the Braeden administration. In the end, the United States and Russia will continue to oscillate between two spheres of cooperation and antagonism, as the two have been historically established as on morally and ideologically different foundations.